here from Andrie Designs. I just wanted to pop a quick little tutorial up together to show you a few different ways to install and attach rectangular rings. So throughout this tutorial I'm going to show you snippets from other video classes that I've filmed. The first snippet is going to be how to install a rectangular ring, and for that I'm showing you part of the Shades of Yesterday tote bag video class, and I'll show you how to lock the ring into the connector or the tab, sorry, so that it's really well held in place, it's stitched really securely and it won't turn once it's installed. And then after that I'm going to show you 3 different snippets on different ways that rectangular rings and their connectors can be attached to bags. So one of the ways, as you can see here with my Shades of Yesterday tote bag, is that it can be attached onto a gusset, and that is an awesome way to attach rectangular rings and connectors. It just really makes an awesome little feature. As you can see, you can add rivets and really dress it up, or you could keep it plain and just have the stitching. It's up to you. Another way you can attach rectangular rings and their connectors is in a seam, and so for that I'm going to show you part of the Peekaboo Purse video class, and that has gorgeous little 3/4 rectangular rings. They're so cute, and they are attached in the top edge of the gusset, so in that top seam. So I'll show you how to position and stitch those in place. And I'm also going to show you how to attach connectors onto the front or back panel of a bag, and for that I'm going to show you part of the Creatives Tote video class that has external connectors that are literally a feature and a big talking point on the Creatives Tote, and I'm going to show you how to attach the connectors and then also how to apply and install connector covers so that they look really professional and they're also really securely installed to take the weight of the bag. So a few different segments in this video tutorial. I hope you enjoy it. Let's get started. To stitch your rectangular ring in place, all you need to do is make sure you have first that you have your zipper foot installed on your machine. You have your needle all the way to one side. I like to have my needle on the right hand side and stitch up underneath the bottom of the ring so the ring is also on the right hand side. And make sure you have a top stitching length set of about 3 to 3.5 millimeters, and that your needle is set to the needle down position. What I like to do is start right in the center of the width of the connector, and we're just going to start by lowering the foot and making sure the foot is hard up against the bottom of the ring in the fabric as much as possible and in the center. From here we're just going to make 1 stitch forward and back just to lock the threads in. And then we're going to stitch all the way towards the side closest to us, right up under that rectangular ring to lock it in place. Once we get to that side closest to us, we're going to put reverse in, and we're going to reverse all the way back to the furthest side of the connector, again right up under the rectangular ring. Once you get there, take reverse off and stitch back to the center. And then just make 1 or 2 stitches back and forth to reinforce. You can lift your needle and take your connector out from under the foot. And that's the first rectangular ring stitched in place. So to position and attach a strap connector to each end of your outer gusset, this is what you need to do. First, you're going to need to line up your outer gusset on your cutting mat. So I find it easiest and most accurate to use the markings on my cutting mat to help make sure everything is square with each other. So what I do is at the short edge of my gusset on one end, I make sure that the line I have picked, so in this case this line here, is centered and that there's an equal distance on both sides. So typically it should be 1 1/4 inches out from that center line on both sides. So I know that that is the center. To make sure that my gusset is square and that it is not off center and not slanted for whatever reason, I then look down to where the gusset is nice and straight down the center of the gusset, which will ultimately be the bottom of the bag, and I make sure that that also is sitting equally between 2 points further down my mat. You won't be able to see that because that's off camera, so I'll just line this top edge back up with the 1/4 points so I have my center, and then I'm just going to eyeball, and on my cutting mat basically the 2 long edges are 1/4 inch in from each long solid line down the sides of the gusset. So there I know my gusset is nice and square, And from here, I'm going to place my ruler on centered again, checking that I'm in line with that center line I've chosen, and that I am 2 inches down from that top raw edge of the gusset. Whoops. Just like that. And then here is where we're going to place one of our connectors. So I'm just going to sit that there. I'm just going to pop some glue on the back of my first connector. You can use tape if you like, you can use pins if you like as well. Because I'm using cork, I'm just going to glue it in place, and it should be enough to just hold there while I stitch it down. So knowing that I have my ruler and it is nice and square if I'm looking up the line up my cutting mat, I'm going to place my connector underneath my ruler so that the top fold of the fabric is up against that bottom edge of the ruler, and that it is centered on that ruler. So I can see that I have my center mark here, and here are my 2 side marks. You might not be able to see it on the camera, but I can see it on my ruler, and they match up with the sides of my connector. So that is all nice and square, and if I eyeball it, it also looks nice and square as well. So I'm just going to stick that down, give that a nice firm press. And if you don't have cork or any sort of delicate fabric, if you've just got quilting cotton or similar, you can give that a press to fuse and set the glue. But in my case, I can't do that, so I'm just going to give it a good press and use the heat from my hands to help dry the glue. And once you're happy with the placement of that first connector, pause the video, come with me, and then get set up at your machine, and I'll show you how to stitch this on to attach. So to begin, we're going to start in the center of the connector again, just like we did when we locked the rectangular ring in place. So just popping that under your foot, hard up under the ring again, over the stitching you've already made. And from here, we're just going to make 2 stitches forwards and 2 stitches back to lock the threads in and help secure the top of the connector. From there, we're going to stitch all the way to this front edge, just until the top stitching that we made earlier. So we're going to stop right on top of that top stitching, make sure your needle is down, and then we're going to lift the foot, collect up the rest of the gusset, and we're going to turn so that we're coming down this first side. So I'm going to drop my foot, and here you'll notice the front of your machine foot will be off the fabric that you're stitching. To compensate for that, my Bernina came with a height compensation tool, which is quite simply just a few pieces of perspex held together with a rivet. They're also known as hump jumper tools. You can grab them on eBay if you need to, and these make a world of difference when sewing bags and installing hardware in particular. So all I'm going to do with my hump jumper tool is I'm just going to place it under the front of my foot, and that will help level out the foot so it has a much easier time stitching and gives a much smoother and even finish, because the back of the foot is essentially going to be lifted up as we stitch off the rectangular ring. So my tool is under the front of my foot, and I'm actually just going to hand wind the first couple of stitches down this first side just to get started. And then from here I'm just going to again adjust my tool and pop it under the foot again, and I've just reduced the height of it now that we're coming down off the rectangular ring, and I'm going to stitch a couple more stitches. And I can see at the back my foot has now come off the ring, so I can remove my tool. We're going to stitch down to this bottom fold, and we're going to stop 1/8 of an inch before the fold. I just eyeball it, however if you like you can rule a stitching line if you prefer. So just following your existing top stitching down to that bottom corner. When you get there, drop your needle, lift your foot, gather up your gusset again, and we're going to stitch across the bottom of that connector, nice and straight, 1/8 of an inch up. Making sure you stop right in where the top stitching is, and make sure your needle is in the needle down position. And I'm actually just going to hand wind my needle ever so slightly, because I just need to come forward just a little bit. There we go. So drop your needle, turn, and put your foot back down, and we're going to stitch up the second side of the connector now. Again, directly over the top stitching you've already made. And as you come to the hardware, the rectangular ring, you're going to notice your foot and your machine is going to struggle a bit because essentially it's trying to hit a bit of a wall. So this is where your tool comes in handy to help lift up your foot so that it can keep stitching normally without causing irregular stitches or having trouble. So it really just levels out your foot and makes things smoother and tidier and gives much better finish. So you're going to stitch right up into that top corner where your stitching is, that's directly under the ring that we made earlier. Make sure your needle is down, turn your gusset one last time, drop your foot, and we're going to stitch back to the center and reinforce 2 to 3 times to finish off. And that is the first connector attached to the gusset. And that looks really good. So from here, just trim off your threads, and if you are going to install rivets, this is now the time to do it. So pause the video and install rivets if you would like to. Otherwise, pop back to your work surface and we will continue. So once you've stitched your first connector in place, it should be looking something like this. And if you've installed rivets, they should also be nice and centered, and I just place them 1/2 inch up from the bottom fold and down from the top row of stitching under the ring. So next we want to attach our strap connectors that we made earlier to the top edges of the gusset. So working on one side of your bag at a time, we're going to take one of the strap connectors, and if you have a preference on which side of the connector faces out and away from the bag, in other words which side is the right side, what I suggest is you hold it above your bag, raw edges to raw edges. So I'm going to have this side as my right side, and then to ensure we attach it correctly, we're going to fold it over and down. So in a way it is right sides together with the gusset. Make sure the raw edges meet of both the connector and the gusset, and just center it between the 2 gusset seams so it's sitting nicely right in the center there. And I actually like to just pin the connectors in place so that they are held and stay put and nice and straight up and down when I go to baste them in the next step. So just like that, and we're going to repeat to position the second connector on the other side of the gusset. So again, it's up to you which side is the right side. I'm going to have this side this time. So I'm going to fold it over and down so it is right sides together with my gusset. I'm going to pin it in place, making sure it's nice and square with the gusset. We don't want wonky connectors. So from here, pause the video, pop over to your machine and baste your 2 connectors to the top edges of the gusset using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And I like to stitch 2 to 3 times across so I know it's held in place really well. Pop back here when you're ready to continue. Once you've basted your connectors in place along each top edge of the gusset, we're going to baste our flap in place. To create your outer panels, first we're going to fold and mark the top, center and center bottom of each panel, just to make sure we know where those points are for assembling the bag further down the track. So just folding each panel in half, just using tailor's chalk, mark the center bottom along the bottom curved edge and the center top along the top curved edge of each of your outer panels, and that's the panels that has your fleece or foam attached to the back. If you are including a label, go ahead and attach that now. You need to attach that to what will be the back panel of the bag, centered horizontally and 1.5 inches down from the top curved edge. Once that's done, we will get ready to attach our handle connectors. So working on one panel at a time, what I find is easiest is, again, I like to use the lines on my cutting mat as a way to line everything up. So we're going to line up our panel so it is nice and square with the cutting mat. So I'm going to mark my center bottom mark, and I'm going to mark my center top mark along the same line. And I'm also going to make sure that my top curved edge is on this line of my mat, because we're going to be measuring down from that mark. So the bottom is ever so slightly lower than the line at the bottom, and that's fine. As long as it is square vertically, we will be all in line. So once you've got your panel in place, just hold it there if you can and pop your ruler on top. And where the handle connectors are going to go is the inner edge. So essentially 2 are going to go like this. So what we're going to do is the inner edge of each connector is going to be 2 3/4 inches out from that center mark, and the top curved edge of each connector is going to be 2 3/4 inches down from the top straight line of or edge of the bag. The bag starts to curve slightly, so we're going to take the measurement from the line on your cutting mat. It's a matter of millimeters. It's not going to make any difference which place you take it from, as long as you do the same on this panel for both connectors and the other panel. So just double checking again that your panel is nice and square on the mat. I'm going to work with one at a time, so I'm going to place my ruler 2 3/4 is there, so that's where the edge is going to go, and I'm going to place it square up on that line as much as I can see, so that I know to come down 2 3/4, which is where the fold of my connector is going to go. So I'm just going to sit that there, and on the back of my connector I'm just going to place some tape. And then we're going to stick it on. So we know that we need to go hard up against the ruler. I'm going to come down 1 2 3/4, which is just there. So once you've got your connector in place, move your ruler and press it down to stick. And that's the first one positioned. So we're actually going to stitch that before we position the second one. And what I like to do, because essentially this fabric, if you've used a baste-in foam like I have, the fabric is not attached to the foam in the middle. So to make sure everything is held in place and it doesn't move while you're stitching the connector on, what I like to do is just pop a few pins in through the fabric and foam around the area that I'm going to stitch, just so I know it's all held in place and it's not going to move on me. So when we stitch our connector on, we're going to stitch hard up under the ring. We're also going to stitch down the first side across the bottom using about a 1/8 allowance. It doesn't really matter because that's actually going to be covered by the connector cover, and then up the other side. We're also going to stitch across so that it's really well held to the panel. I like to just draw a stitching line just so it's easy and I don't have to think about it, and it's nice and easy to follow. So I'm just going to put a stitching line under the ring so that I then have top corner points for my cross, and then I'm just going to mark one down in one way and that one down in that direction. So there's my cross, and I know I'm going to stitch under the ring. So pause the video, get set up at your machine with your zipper foot on, top stitching length of about 3 to 3.5 millimeters, and we will get started. I'll see you over there. So to attach your handle connector to your outer panel, make sure your zipper foot is on, your needle is all the way to one side. I like to have it on the right, and you have your needle set to the needle down position and a stitch length of about 3 to 3.5 millimeters. I'm just going to pop the connector under the foot, and we're going to start in the top left hand corner. So just drop your foot down, and all we're going to do to start is just make one stitch forward and back just to lock those threads in. And then we're going to stitch right up underneath that ring to create the first join onto that outer panel. When you get to the other side, you want to stop right at that row of top stitching that you can see from when we created the handle connector in the beginning. Just make sure your needle is dropped, and then we're actually just going to lift and rotate, ready to stitch down this first side of the connector. As you can see, the front of my foot is sitting up, and that is because the hardware behind it is lifting the back of the foot. So just to balance it out, I just have a height compensation tool. Some people have what they call a hump jumper, and what you can do is just pop it under the front of the foot to level the foot out so it still stitches and feeds through really evenly. While I'm using that, I'm going to actually look in from the right hand side and just make sure that I'm stitching directly over the stitching that's already there. So just tuck that under. Now I'm just going to get my needle in the right spot. There we go. So I'm just going to make a couple of slow stitches down just until my foot comes off the hardware at the back. That's pretty good. And then I'm just going to continue to stitch down that connector almost to the bottom, about 1/8 from the bottom. It doesn't have to be exact because you're not going to see this at all. Make sure your needle is in the needle down position, rotate, and now we're going to stitch across the bottom. So it looks like I'm about 1/4 inch up from the bottom. That's absolutely fine. As I said, no one's going to see it at all. So stitching across the bottom of the connector, nice and straight-ish if you can. And again, stopping when you get to that row of top stitching on the connector from earlier. Rotate, and we're going to stitch up that final side. As you come up, your foot will start to hit the hardware, so just lift up and put your height compensation tool or a hump jumper or something under the back of the foot. That will help lift it up and level it out and make sewing these last few stitches a lot easier. So once you get down, well, back to that top corner, we're going to sew the cross in the connector. So we're going to rotate and sew from top left down to bottom right, following the lines we drew earlier. Leave your needle down and we're going to stitch across the bottom again. To bottom left, and then we're going to stitch from bottom left up to top right. And when we get right up into that corner and it's nice and tidy, I'm just going to wind my needle to get it where I want it. We're going to essentially reverse back to where we started. So lock reverse in and stitch nice and slowly and carefully across the bottom of the ring, right over the stitching you made earlier, back to the start. And as always, a couple of stitches forwards and back just to lock your threads in and make sure it's really secure. And you can finish off and cut your threads. So that's the first one done. It looks really good. So from here, pop back to your workstation and we'll move on with the next step. So once your first connector is attached and stitched in place, you can trim off your threads. You can remove the pins that were holding your fabric down if you pinned it in place. And that's the first one done. So from here, we're going to repeat that exact same process to attach a second connector to the other side of that same panel. So just like before, we're going to pop some tape on the back of the next connector. Going to line the panel up on my cutting mat so it is nice and square, like that, and then I'm going to measure 2 3/4 out and 2 3/4 down. And that's where the second one is going to go. So that looks really good. So just a little tip that I do, I'm a little bit particular with seams and edges and folds and things. So what I've done is on this first connector, the double folded edge of the connector is facing in towards the center and that single fold is on the outside. So on this side I'm going to do that but in reverse. So I've got my double folded edge here facing inwards and the single folded edge facing outwards, and it just gives a nice professional finish because they're both mirror of each other and they're purposefully put there to look the same but in reverse. So from here all we need to do is pin, draw our X on and stitch this one down. So pause the video, go ahead and stitch your second connector in place and then pop back here when you're ready to continue. So once you've attached a second connector to that same panel, your panel should be looking something like this. Got 2 connectors attached, both are level, equally spaced out from the center, and both a mirror image of each other in terms of the fold of the connector fabric. So from here, all we need to do is repeat that same process for the remaining outer panel. So measuring, remember you're going to measure out 2 3/4 inches and down to the top of the fabric 2 3/4 inches and attach both connectors in exactly the same process. So pause the video, pop off and do that, and head back here when you're ready to continue. Once your handle connectors are all attached, it's time to cover them up and really add that extra feature to the panels. by attaching the connector covers. So regardless of if you have raw edge ones out of cork or leather like I do, or if you've made the fabric ones like we did earlier, this is how we're going to attach them. So the easiest way I find is to use tape on the back of the connector. Glue also works well, otherwise you can pin them. It's just quite thick to get through, especially in the center. So yeah, I find tape is usually the easiest way. And all you're going to do is simply place your adhesive material, so to speak, on the back of one connector on the wrong side. If you've used fabric, it'll be on the side with the slit, because remember that is the wrong side. And then all we're going to do is place it directly over top of one connector. You want to have the straight flat edge of the cover sitting right up just over top of the stitching you've made, and you want to center it horizontally as best you can. You can measure if you like, however I just eyeball it and see what looks centered, and I look at the gap up here and what looks even on both sides, and that it's nice and square in relation to the connector and then the panel. Once you're happy with your placement, just stick it down and it is ready to be stitched in place. So come with me, we'll head over to the machine and I'll show you how to top stitch your connector in place. To attach the connector, I'm going to use my walking foot. I just personally prefer that it helps guide all of the layers through the machine, and when I go over the area with the hardware, I just use my height compensation tool to level the foot out. However, if you find it easier, you could use your zipper foot instead. I also like using my walking foot because it helps me follow a seam allowance, whereas on a zipper foot it's very hard to, you kind of have to just eyeball it. So we're going to be stitching around the outer edge of the connector using a 1/8 of an inch seam allowance and a normal top stitch length of about 2 to 2.5 millimeters. As always, make sure your needle is set to the needle down position, and I typically like to start right in the center of the top straight edge. So I just position it under my foot. It's a snug fit, but it does fit. Grab the tails of the thread, and we're not going to make any reverse stitches because it's a nice top stitching feature. So we will at the end thread the threads through to the back and tie off with a knot. So once you're lined up, we're just going to nice and slow and steady, actually put this under here. Slow and steady, we're going to stitch right across to this first corner using a 1/8 allowance. And just adjust your tool or your fabric or your panel as needed, because this can be a little bit fiddly, but fussiness pays off because there's such a feature on the bag. So when you get to that first corner, make sure your needle is down, lift your foot and just rotate your panel ready to come down that first side. So yep, that looks good. I'm going to drop my foot, but first I'm going to place my tool under that side so my foot's fairly level, and now I'm going to stitch down and around the curve very slowly and very deliberately. These can take a little bit of practice stitching these covers on, and what I recommend if you are uncertain stitching curves and you find you do the first one and you really don't like it, is consider doing the ones on what will be the back panel of the bag first and treat them a bit like your practice ones, and then do the front ones last, so that you've sort of had a bit of practice and you're a bit more confident by that stage as well. And then I'm just going to put my tool at the back because I'm coming up to the hardware and I don't want my foot to be wonky. I'm just going to stitch right up to that top corner, if we can get there. And I'm just going to lift, have a look. I think I'm in the corner. I think I've gone far enough, but I'm going to check. No, I need to go just a little bit further to get the 1/8 on the straight top edge. So I'm just going to hand wind ever so slightly, a small stitch there, and turn, and that's ready to come back across. So I'm going to put this tool at the back. Might use the double just to lift my foot up so it's nice and level. I've got my tails, there they are, waiting for me. And we're just going to go 1/8 back to where we started. Remember, we're not reversing at the beginning and end, so when you get back to where you started, you can lift your work out. And that looks really good. I'm really happy with that. So from here, pause the video, pop back to your workstation, and we will continue. Now that your first connector cover is stitched in place, to finish off and secure those threads, we're just going to take a needle and feed them through to the wrong side of the panel. And then take all the threads and just tie them off in a simple little reef knot. I like to use a double knot just so that I know it's nice and secure. There we go. So the first connector, oh, there's my needle, is attached. So from here, pause the video and repeat this process to attach the remaining 3 connectors to the remaining covers, the remaining connector covers to the remaining connectors on your bag. And that's all there is to it. There's several different ways you can install rectangular rings, and to be honest, I'm sure there are other ways as well. These are just some of the common ways that Andrie Designs Patterns uses. So I hope you found this tutorial helpful. I hope you've learned some little tips and tricks or been inspired, got some great ideas for your next bag. As always, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact me via the contact page of my website, or alternatively, you can ask in our patterns group on Facebook as well, and I will post links to both of those in the description below. For me, that's all for today, so until next time, happy sewing!